You study for Security Plus. You passed the exam. You updated your resume, your LinkedIn profile, and you started applying for entry-level cybersecurity jobs. But then nothing happened. You're meeting with the requirements for the job descriptions. You've got certifications everyone says you need, but you're not getting interviews. The responses you do get are rejections, and you're starting to wonder what you're doing wrong. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You didn't do anything wrong. You followed advice that made sense when people first started giving it, but the market changed faster than the advice did, unfortunately. Security Plus still matters, but it's become so common that it's now a minimum baseline rather than something that gets you hired. And understanding why that happened will help you figure out what to do next. So as far as the shift I want to talk about here, Security Plus didn't lose value because the content got worse. It lost its competitive edge because it became very common. Most of this happened because of certain DoD requirements, that established baseline certifications, for anyone working in certain information assurance roles for the Department of Defense or contractors. Security Plus satisfies multiple categories in those requirements. That made it the obvious choice for organizations that needed compliance documentation. Suddenly, contractors needed certified people to win and keep contracts. Security Plus became a checkbox, not necessarily because hiring managers thought it was the best measure of capability, but because it was required. And as the certification became more accessible through boot camps and online training programs, the number of certified people grew substantially. CompTIA has issued millions of Security Plus certifications at this point. When you apply for an entry-level job now, you're competing against hundreds of other candidates with the exact same credential. Employers see Security Plus the way they see a bachelor's degree. It might be required, but having it doesn't make you stand out. It means you met the minimum threshold to be considered. So what do certifications actually prove? Now, let's talk about that for a second. Security Plus tests whether you can recognize correct answers to structured questions. Can you identify the difference between asymmetric and symmetric encryption? Do you know what a firewall does? Can you match controls to common threats? Those are important foundations, but they're not the same as being able to do security work. Certifications, as you may know, measure knowledge recall. They don't measure judgment. They don't assess whether you can diagnose an ambiguous problem when the systems don't match anything you studied. They don't show you how you'd weigh trade-offs between security and usability. They don't reveal, whether you can explain a technical issue to someone who isn't technical, or adapt your approach when your initial assumptions turn out to be, wrong. Employers need people who can think through situations without obvious answers. Analysts who can investigate alerts that might be false positives or, might start or be the start of an actual breach. Administrators who can balance security requirements against business needs. People who can explain why something matters without drowning everyone in jargon. The gap between knowing definitions and demonstrating judgment is what employers try to assess in interviews. When they ask you, to walk through how you'd approach a problem, they're not testing whether you memorize the right answer. They're evaluating more about how you can think. I've seen this firsthand when interviewing people for security roles. You ask someone a straightforward question like, what would you do if a user reported a suspicious email? And almost everyone who has studied security can give you the textbook answer, right? Check the sender, look at the links, examine the headers, maybe isolate the message itself. But then I'll change one detail. What if the user already clicked the link? What if they entered their credentials? What if we don't know whether MFA was enabled or not? That's where you start seeing the difference. Some candidates get stuck because the situation no longer matches the answer they prepared. Others start asking questions. What access does the user have? Are there signs of a successful login? Do we have authentication logs? Should we reset the credentials or revoke active sessions? Who else received the message? That second candidate might not know every technical answer, but they're showing me something much more important. They know how to investigate a problem when the answer isn't obvious. And that's much closer to what cybersecurity work actually looks like. And so talking more about the entry-level problem here, with all of this that I've heard from many, part of the frustration comes from a mismatch between what jobs are called and what they actually require. A lot of positions labeled, entry-level cybersecurity expect you to already have experience. They want someone who's, worked as a help desk, who's understand, Active Directory because they administered it, right? Who knows how to troubleshoot network issues because they've done it dozens of times. The job description says entry level. It lists security plus and maybe a degree, but the actual expectations include troubleshooting ability, familiarity with enterprise environments, and problem-solving skills that only come from prior work. This happens because true entry-level security jobs are rare. Most organizations can't afford to hire someone with no IT background and then go ahead and train them from scratch in both general IT and security-specific skills. They need people who already understand the technical foundation. You can meet, the stated requirements and still be considered unqualified because you're missing the unstated prerequisites. Understanding that doesn't make it any less frustrating, but it does clarify, what you're actually competing against. So as far as what employers actually need, when hiring managers review your application, they're trying to answer questions your certifications may not address, right? Can you troubleshoot technical problems independently? Security work involves investigating issues where you don't immediately know what's wrong. They need evidence that you can work through ambiguity, systematically. Can you explain technical concepts clearly? Can you write incident reports? You'll communicate with other teams. Sometimes you'll explain security decisions to people without technical backgrounds. They're looking for clear communication, not just technical vocabulary. Do you understand how concepts connect? Security isn't isolated facts. It's understanding how systems, work together, where vulnerabilities emerge from interactions, between components, how controls affect entire environments. They want systems thinking, not memorized definitions. Can you learn and adapt? Technology changes, new vulnerabilities emerge, attack techniques evolve. They need people who can learn continuously, not just recall what they studied for an exam. These capabilities don't show up on transcripts. Employers have to infer them from how you present your experience, how you talk about problems you've solved, and what evidence you can provide of actually applying knowledge. So what can you do, right? So how do you demonstrate these capabilities when you don't have cybersecurity job experience, right? That's the big question here. Build something you can explain and defend. Set up a home lab, document a security assessment on your own network, analyze a published breach report, and write about what you would have done differently. The goal isn't perfection, it's creating evidence of how you approach problems. When you can walk through something with someone you've built, and why you made the specific choices you made, what didn't work initially, and how you troubleshot it, you're demonstrating judgment and problem solving, which is huge. Contribute to security communities in ways that reveal your understanding. Answer questions in forums. Write about how you solved a specific problem. Explain a concept in your own words instead of maybe copying documentation or using other tools. When employers read your explanations, they can assess whether you actually understand the material. Someone who can explain why a particular approach makes sense in one context but not another is showing a deeper understanding that someone reciting textbook definitions. If you don't have IT experience, get some. Help desk work teaches troubleshooting methodology, right? System admin builds understanding of how enterprise environments actually function. Network support develops a technical foundation that makes security work more effective. Many successful security, professionals, and others, in IT roles first. It's very important that that foundation isn't wasted time. It's what makes them capable, when they transition into security positions. And I'm, one example of that. Practice explaining your reasoning, not just stating answers. When you study, focus on why the actual controls work. In interviews, walk through your thought process instead of maybe jumping to conclusions. Someone who says, I would implement multi-factor authentication, sounds like they may have memorized a recommendation. Someone who says, I start by identifying which accounts have the highest privilege and greatest exposure, then prioritize MFA based on risk and user impact. Sounds like they're thinking through the actual problem. So as far as some realistic paths here, after talking about all this, the path into cybersecurity often looks different than the simplified advice actually suggests. Don't only apply to jobs explicitly labeled as cybersecurity. Look for IT roles with security components. Consider compliance positions that involve security policies. Explore internal opportunities where you can take on several security adjacent responsibilities. Building a track record matters more than getting a specific job title immediately. Experience conducting access reviews, implementing configurations, responding to security questionnaires, supporting compliance audits, right? All of that contributes to your foundation. Consider organizations where you can grow into security responsibilities. Smaller companies often need IT generalists who handle security as a part of a broader role, right? Managed security providers are a great example. They expose you to, multiple environments. You can build relevant experience even if your title doesn't say security analyst. Recognize the timeline may be longer than you hoped. This isn't working about harder, right? It's something that breaking into competitive fields often requires building foundations that take some time. So here's a final thought. Like I said kind of before, Security Plus still matters. Keep it current, but don't expect it to be sufficient on its own. Your priority now is demonstrating that you can think like a security professional, not just say that you studied security concepts. That means building evidence of your judgment, problem-solving ability, and practical understanding. Focus on creating things that you can explain, contribute in ways that reveal how you think, build your IT foundation of, if you need it, practice articulating your reasoning. Go ahead and target opportunities that might not look exactly like your ideal job, but move you in the actual right direction. The market shifted. That's generally frustrating when you follow advice that turn out to be incomplete, but understanding what actually gets people hired gives you better direction than doing more of what isn't working. So you're not starting over. You have foundational knowledge. Now you just need to show employers you can use it. So what's one project you can build this month that would let you demonstrate how you approach a security problem? Start there. Make it small enough to actually finish, specific enough to show your thinking, document well enough that you can explain it. That's what moves you forward. If this was helpful, let me know what you're working on or what you're stuck on. Subscribe for more of this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.